Hey everyone, welcome back to my podcast, Anatomy and Physiology Bit by Bit. This is your host, Dr. Steve Sullivan, coming to you from Bucks County, Pennsylvania, where I teach anatomy and physiology at Bucks County Community College, and I've been doing that since 2002. Today we begin our discussion of human development, beginning with the fertilization of an ovum and ending with aging and senescence, which is the degeneration of our organs and tissues associated with aging. It will take a couple of episodes to get us all the way through. Welcome to any new listeners out there, and just a reminder that this podcast follows the traditional trajectory of a majors level, 2-semester college anatomy and physiology course. The kind you'd expect students to take prior to nursing, physical therapy, occupational therapy, radiography programs, etc. Things like that. So if you're looking for help along the way in a class like that, finish this episode out, but then you should start with episode 1 and move forward from there. Today I have a very special guest that I think you are going to love. Recently I got the pleasure of speaking with New York Times best-selling science writer Sam Kean. I am a huge fan. He is the author of such books as The Disappearing Spoon, The Violinist's Thumb, The Tale of the Dueling Neurosurgeons, Caesar's Last Breath, The Bastard Brigade, The Ice Pick Surgeon, and his latest book, Dinner with King Tut. Sam's stories have appeared in The Best American Science and Nature Writing, The New Yorker, The Atlantic, and Slate. His work has also been featured on NPR's Radiolab, Science Friday, and All Things Considered. His books have won and been nominated for several science writing awards, including the Science Friday Book of the Year. He tells engaging and entertaining true stories about science, scientific discoveries, ethics, and more. Kean also has an amazing podcast called The Disappearing Spoon, where he tells all the fun stories that aren't in his books. If you're interested in science, you have got to get Sam Kean's books and listen to his podcast. For me, he's like Malcolm Gladwell for science. Okay, enough gushing. Here's my conversation with award-winning, best-selling science writer, Sam Kean. Okay, welcome to the show, New York Times bestselling author, science writer Sam Kean. It is great to have you on the podcast.
Well, hi, thanks for having me.
Well, I'm very excited, and to be honest, I am geeking out a little bit. I've heard you on Radiolab, one of my all-time favorite NPR shows, and you might actually enjoy knowing this, but my dear friend Alan, who was a recently retired education professor at the College of New Jersey, used to assign The Disappearing Spoon to his teacher ed students. He used it to help show how to take a complex topic and make it informative, relevant, relatable for teacher ed. It's great.
Well, that's very flattering. Thank you.
Yeah, he's pretty jealous of me right now. So I want to start up by asking about The Disappearing Spoon. What inspired you to write about the periodic table of elements? And can you tell the listeners what that title refers to?
Yeah, so the premise of the book was to find a funny or weird or spooky story about every single element on the periodic table. And, I did manage to cram all 118 of them in there. Some just make a cameo, but each element has a role to play and a story to tell. And to me, I wanted to write about the periodic table overall because it's so iconic in science. And it's really the richest source of stories in science because you can talk about chemistry there, you can talk about physics and biology, but even beyond that, you can talk about the periodic table and money, periodic table and politics. All sorts of different things intersect with the periodic table in ways that you really wouldn't expect. So because of all those rich stories, I just thought it would be a lot of fun to try to tell them all and kind of gather them together in one book. And you asked about the title story. That refers to an element called gallium. And gallium sits right below aluminum on the periodic table. And because they sit right next to each other, one below the other, they have very similar properties. And they look a lot alike, too. And in fact, if you had a hunk of gallium and a hunk of aluminum sitting in front of you, you probably would not be able to tell them apart, except that gallium has one unusual property in that it melts at about 85, 86 degrees Fahrenheit. So even on a warm day, if you're holding some gallium in your hand, it will soften up, it'll start to melt and run between your fingers. So the title, The Disappearing Spoon, comes in because it's sort of a, I guess, classic nerd science prank to make a spoon out of gallium metal and then to serve that to somebody with hot coffee or tea or something like that. And they, of course, just think they're getting a regular old aluminum spoon until they start stirring the hot liquid with it and it melts on them. So it disappears on them. So that's where the title story comes from.
It sounds like a pretty cool prank.
It is a pretty cool. Yeah, you can see videos of it online. I describe it in the book, stuff like that.
Oh, that's neat. I'll link a video in the show notes so that listeners can take a look.
Okay.
Where I teach in suburban Philadelphia, I'm just outside of Northeast Philly, and there's a really big Russian population. And I will say that the periodic table is such a source of pride in that community because of Mendeleev.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting one. And you mentioned something about all of the aspects of the periodic table that come in. And there's an old saying that says, all biology is chemistry and all chemistry is physics. And in your book, you talk about the physics of the periodic table and how the interaction between the particles and the electrons is really physical, which determines the chemical properties.
Yeah, I mean, it's all related. I think that's one nice thing about writing about the periodic table is that you can see those interactions. You can see how, you go from a smaller scale of protons and electrons up to the scale of full atoms and molecules, move from that into biology. It's really kind of a seamless, beautiful transition from one to the other.
Yeah, a friend of mine who's a science ed professor in New Jersey researched why in high schools we teach biology first, chemistry second, and physics third, rather than kind of going physics, chemistry, biology, which would make more sense. And the history of it actually is because it's alphabetical. Like frustratingly enough, it's not a pedagogical answer. It is a very frustrating answer that it's just they did it alphabetically and then no one ever changes it because that's the way it's always been done. Which I tell my students is the worst reason to ever do something. As my listeners know, I'm an anatomy and physiology professor, and scientific concepts can be dense and technical. And I always tell my students and potential users of Anatomy and Physiology Digital Suite that my job is to simplify the content without being inaccurate. So how do you balance scientific accuracy with the entertaining storytelling that you're known for when writing for a general audience?
I think the one thing I make sure is that there is a story there first. I find a cool story and figure out how to weave the science in there. I think sort of the classic thing that science writers do is just think about telling the story to your grandmother or a cousin, someone who's not an expert in the field, and you need to get the information across to them without becoming too technical about it. And it's just sort of a natural transition. We all have different registers we use, different vocabulary. We might, bring in more metaphors and things like that when we're talking to someone who's not an expert. So I think we all have that ability inside of us. We just need to be a little more conscious about it and think about it. And it can be a little frustrating sometimes in that, there's a classic idea that you don't really know a topic until you teach a topic because you realize suddenly, oh, wait, there are some gaps in my explanation here. So even doing that can be a good idea to show you where those gaps are.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I thought that you don't know something until you teach it. And then I really found out you don't know something till you start to write about it. And when I started writing for McGraw-Hill, that's when I realized, wow, I have a lot of research to do. How do you decide which details of a complex scientific topic to include and which to leave out without oversimplifying?
I do think, sort of the grandmother thing or the cousin thing, keeping that in mind is a good rule of thumb. So it can help with that as well. And what I'm trying to do largely is give enough science to tell the story, make sure that people can understand why it's important to the main character, why they need to know this, how it's going to affect either their lives or science in general. And then, so just as long as they have enough details to understand it, I think that's a good start for me in just getting some of the science across. And if they're really curious about it, they can go follow up or read about it a little bit more, or have bonus episodes of my podcast, stuff like that, where I can go into a little bit more detail. But as long as I can get through the story and understand it, I think that's probably good enough for what I'm trying to do. Or there are cases when the science is just so cool that I can't leave it out. And I just, want to include this fun little fact or detail. So I have to kind of work up and build up toward that. But those are the kind of the things I'm keeping in mind when I'm figuring out how much detail to put in. You will have editors and people looking at your stuff, especially if you're writing books, and they can come in and say, okay, I'm not following this, or we get a little too in the weeds here. And that's something you pick up over time too. So it's not like you have to decide all by yourself and that's going to be the final word on it. You have people often looking at things as well. So that can help, or ask someone to look at it.
Yeah, that's nice to know. And you've got another set of eyes kind of saying, look, I got to think of this from the reader's perspective.
Yeah, exactly.
That's key. With my students, sometimes I'll get quote unquote complaints because they say I go off on tangents too much about some of the scientific stuff. And a lot of it is because the science is pretty cool. And I really want them to see that.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of my students, the vast majority of them and the listeners of this podcast are preparing for a clinical field. And you've written about ethically complex moments in science history. For example, in The Disappearing Spoon, you wrote about the development of chemical weapons like chlorine gas. Are there historical stories that you think medical, nursing, and other clinical students should study to better understand the ethical dimensions of their profession?
Yeah, in fact, I wrote a book called The Ice Pick Surgeon, and the premise of that book was about scientists who got so obsessed with some topic or idea that they actually committed crimes in the name of science. So it's kind of science meets true crime. And just by the nature of that idea, a lot of the chapters in there were medical chapters, doctors interacting with people, anatomists actually, like John Hunter going after bodies, grave robbing. The title story, The Ice Pick Surgeon, is about lobotomies. So there's a lot of different case stories from science history that really get into the dilemmas that scientists face and why they put themselves in these situations. And sometimes you can kind of see things from both points of view. For instance, the early days of grave robbing, doctors and anatomists, they needed to know how the body worked. They wanted to know how it was put together so that they could help their patients. But no one donated their bodies to science at the time. So they resorted to grave robbing, which was not ethical, but they had another ethical goal in mind. So in the book, I try to discuss cases like that where there is kind of a dilemma sometimes. You're trying to figure things out. So for medical stuff, especially, I think that book does go into some of the more classic dilemmas, talks about if you're going into clinical work, some things you can do to sort of you set up tripwires for yourself and to make sure you're taking ethics in mind and some guidelines too about, what general principles people have used historically and what, where it's going in the future.
That's interesting. I remember years and years ago, probably over 15 years ago, there was a human anatomy and physiology conference in Baltimore, and we had a speaker who talked about the early days of grave robbing at the university. The cadaver lab was in like a sub basement of the university because it was illegal for them to be dissecting cadavers. And so the professors from the medical school would pay grave robbers to come in and bring them bodies.
They called them resurrectionists sometimes. That was their
resurrectionists.
Yeah, that was their title.
That's a good spin to put on it. It sounds better than grave robbing. Many of your stories involve accidental discoveries. How do you think science students can reframe failure as part of the scientific and clinical learning process?
I think one thing that pops to mind when you ask that is there's a famous saying by Linus Pauling, who was a chemist, double Nobel Prize winner, did early work on DNA, so very, very smart, sickle cell anemia, just brilliant, brilliant scientist. And he famously said once, someone asked him, how do you have so many good ideas? And he said, well, the real trick is to come up with lots and lots of ideas and throw the bad ones out. So he was very invested in the idea that you just have to try things sometimes, have ideas, try an experiment out. It's not going to work, but at the very least, you are eliminating possibilities and you're going to learn something from that. So I don't think anyone would suspect that if they just dropped you in a foreign country like France or something and you didn't speak French, that you're immediately going to pick it up. It's not a matter of whether you're smart or not. You just have to spend time doing it. You have to be immersed in it in order to understand what's going on. And science is the same way. You're not going to jump in and immediately get the right answer the first time. So you need to spend some time with it. Look at the failures, as frustrating as it can be, as an opportunity to either eliminate possibilities or to make yourself more familiar with it. And then keep Pauling's dictum in mind that the best way to have a brilliant idea is to have lots of ideas and just get rid of the bad ones.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a huge thing for students, especially the ones who are really afraid of failure. And I mean, this is like on a smaller scale, students that are just afraid to raise their hand and answer a question in class because they're afraid to be wrong. They're afraid to embarrass themselves. They're afraid that if they give the wrong answer, that I'm somehow judging them for that.
Right.
And I tell my students, I learn way more about them from the questions that they ask than from the answers they give. Because I also think another way to have great ideas is to have a lot of questions. I tell my students the most powerful sentence in science is, I don't know. You know, I mean, and that's not my thing. I think Neil deGrasse Tyson says that all the time. But it's okay to not know. So
yeah, that's the sort of science. Yeah, exactly.
For sure. And the problem is, instead of just being okay with I don't know and then expanding inquiry, we just make up the answers. And that seems to happen a lot.
Another famous saying, Mark Twain, is it's not what you don't know that's going to get you in trouble. It's what you think you know that just ain't so that's going to get you.
Yeah. Right. There's another quote I really like from Bertrand Russell that I put on my bottom of my email that says something along the lines of, it's a great thing to have an open mind. The trick is to not open your mind so much that your brain starts to fall out. So in addition to your books, you have a podcast called The Disappearing Spoon. What kind of topics do you cover on your podcast?
So I'm primarily a book writer, and I come across a lot of ideas, a lot of great little stories that just don't fit in the book because maybe they're a bit too much of a tangent, or I'm just following something up and I find some little cool nugget. And I long wanted to keep those stories around and do something with them, even if they didn't fit in the book. So the podcast is a really good way to have a home for those stories. And they're usually pretty bite-sized. They run about 20 minutes or so pretty low commitment. And they just tell a fun, interesting little story. And unlike my book, The Disappearing Spoon, the podcast is not just about chemistry, periodic table, and stuff. That one really ranges widely. And in fact, I've done a lot of stories about medicine and related fields like that. It's just kind of where my interest has been the past, year or two. So I've been doing a lot of stories based on that. But that's the basic idea of the podcast.
Yeah, it's really good. I started listening to it a few weeks ago, and it is easy to get an episode in on your way to work. If you only have a short commute, that's okay because it might only be 20, 25 minutes. And that's great. And a really, really interesting, fun story. So I highly recommend the podcast, and I will have a link to it in the show notes for anyone who's looking for it. So the last thing I want to talk about is your new book, which is called Dinner with King Tut. And it talks about how archaeologists are recreating the sights, sounds, smells, and tastes of lost civilizations. I'm particularly interested in smells and tastes. I really love to travel, and every time my wife and I go somewhere, the first thing we do is we do a walking food tour of whatever city we're in. And we learn as much as we can about the food that people eat in this city. And then, in fact, when I did an episode on smell and taste, which is episode 29, instead of interviewing a professor or a neurologist, I interviewed a friend of mine from high school who's a chef in Oakland, California. And we talk about how he builds a menu based on all the sensations associated with the dish. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. But can you tell us about this new book, Dinner with King Tut, what you learned and what inspired you to research this topic?
Yeah, so briefly, I'd always had a bit of a gripe with archaeology in that I think archaeology is a fascinating field for what it teaches us about the deep history of humankind, who we are, where we came from, all these big meaty questions. I really love that kind of stuff about archaeology. But every time I would go to an archaeological site, a dig, it looked like the most boring work I could ever imagine. It was a bunch of people with sunburns in the dirt, digging little pot shards out of the ground. It looked so tedious to me. And there was just kind of this disconnect in my mind between the amazing things you can learn from archaeology and the monotony and the grind of the daily work. So I wrote this book about a field called experimental archaeology, where the archaeologists are actually doing and creating things. It's much more lively, much more sensory rich. They are recreating ancient foods, making ancient stone tools. I attended an authentic Roman banquet, which was pretty cool. I spent a day out in Utah with a guy who'd built a giant medieval catapult, and we spent a day flinging these giant garden stones around this little field in Utah. I learned I got a hand poke tattoo, and I got to give someone a hand poke tattoo, which was a little scary, but I got to try it. Got to try an ancient type of surgery. I got to just do a lot of different, very cool things that really brought the past alive in a very fun, lively, sensory rich way. And you mentioned food, like smell and taste. That was one thing that popped up over and over, because there's a lot of interest in ancient foods, lost recipes, things like that. And especially the title story, the Dinner with King Tut stories, talking about Egyptian beer and Egyptian bread. I got to make some of those and try, and the Egyptian bread I had was the best loaf of bread I've ever had in my life. It was
Wow.
absolutely phenomenally good. They didn't use the same type of grains we do nowadays. They used what's called emmer, a different type of grain. And they had sourdough yeast in there, so it was a nice sourdough tang, whole wheat. They had coriander in it. It was absolutely phenomenal. So getting to try all those unusual foods, everything from King Tut's bread to I had walrus, I had insects of all sorts, llama, guinea pig, like all these different foods. It was a lot of fun to be able to do that. So again, it really brought the past alive and just it's a fun, new, interesting way to do archaeology.
That's really fun. So I've been to Cairo and I don't remember the bread. I'm not sure if that was in a restaurant on Zamalek or something like that. But what is a hand poke tattoo? Because I'll tell you, like a few years ago, the last time my wife and I were in Bangkok, we were looking for a tattoo shop to get a bamboo tattoo. They do tattoos in Thailand where they sharpen bamboo, and that's how they do the tattoo. And then when we found the place, it was closed, so we never got them.
Yeah, it's using the same thing. There's different ways they do it. I think some places have what it's basically like a little rake that they use to bring the ink in. So I'm not sure what they were doing there, but yeah, you're using something like bamboo or bone was very common way back when. They would make a bone needle and give people tattoos with that. But yeah, that's the basic idea. Instead of having a tattoo gun, electronic device, they would make a bone needle, dip that in ink, and apply it under the skin that way. So yeah, that's the basic idea.
You buy a pair of socks, that's two socks. You buy a pair of Bombas socks, that's four socks. Because one purchased is one donated. Socks are the #1 most requested clothing item in homeless shelters. So when you buy a pair of super comfortable Bombas socks, you're also donating a pair. Bombas customers have powered over 150 million donations. So Bombas would like to thank you 150 million times. But we only have like 30 seconds. Go to bombas.com and use code AUDIO for 20% off your first purchase. That's BOMBAS.com and use code AUDIO at checkout.
That's great. So the bread and the beer from ancient Egypt, you got to try those?
I did, yeah. The beer I
Yeah.
was able to make at home again with the emmer grain.
Right.
And the beer was a bit unusual in that it doesn't have hops in it. So hops is kind of a dominant flavor in modern beer, but Egyptians did not use it. And again, it was sort of a sour taste based on the yeast they had. So to me, it tasted more like a kombucha than it did what we would think of as a beer nowadays. And yeah, so that was pretty good. But the bread, again, was phenomenal. I talked to a guy in LA who his kind of claim to fame in his previous life was that he had invented the Xbox gaming system. And then after that, he moved on to different work. And in his spare time, he decided he was going to make different types of historical bread, made medieval bread first, and then moved on to Egyptian bread. And he really went all out with this, kind of based on a bad experience he'd had. He'd sort of done um, kind of a very low effort attempt to make Egyptian bread. You know, just got some grains, put something on Twitter like, "Hey, I made this Egyptian bread," and he kind of got raked for doing that. A lot of people said that's crap, like that's totally wrong. Like, what are you doing? And instead of getting defensive about it, he said, you know what? They're right. I did a pretty bad job of this, but now I want to do a better job of this. So he flew over to Egypt with some microbiology equipment. He sampled the bread molds that they would have used that they found in archaeological sites. So he got some ancient yeast, reconstituted it, sourced some heirloom grains, sourced the type of wood they would have used to cook the bread. He got some ancient molds made. He put the loaves in there. He built a fire pit in his backyard. And so he just went all out
Wow.
recreating this bread. And again, it was totally worth it because it was amazing, amazing bread. So that was definitely one of the highlights of the book.
I would love to try that sometime. I don't have the time or resources to do all that, but maybe next time I'm in Egypt, there'll be a street vendor or something. We'll find it. Well, Sam Kean, thank you so much for joining me. This was a lot of fun, super interesting. I think everyone who's listening to this podcast will get a lot out of your books. I'm going to put a link to your website so that they can find how to find everything. Once again, thank you so much. Is there anything else that you want to share? How people can find you, maybe on social media?
Yeah, I'm active on Twitter. It's Sam_Kean. My Instagram is History Schmistery. Or if you just go to my website, samkean.com. So SAMKEAN.com. You can find excerpts from the books. You can find the podcast there. You can find me on social media. Everything's at samkean.com.
That's fantastic. Once again, thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming on.
Well, thanks for having me.
Oh my God, how much fun was that? I love Sam Kean. I love his books. I love his podcast. You have got to check him out. He's got so many good stories to tell. He's so good at telling them. It's funny, it's engaging, it's light, it's easy to understand. He reaches the masses, but doesn't water it down. So good. So good. I am posting all of the links to everywhere you can find everything Sam Kean does in the show notes. Check him out, samkean.com, SAMKEAN.com. That is his website, and on that website, you can get to anywhere you need to go. Once again, thank you so much, Sam Kean, for joining me on the show. That was a huge honor and obviously a pleasure for me. Okay, so now it's time to get into the content of human development. That means we're into developmental biology, which is the study of the anatomical and physiological changes that take place in an organism from the fertilization of the egg cell all the way to old age. We're going to start with fertilization. We didn't get to that in the reproductive unit. We really got to everything that leads up to fertilization. But the actual fertilization of an egg cell from a sperm cell, these are two gametes that are each haploid, coming together and combining their chromosomes, is a big deal. From the moment an egg is fertilized, a process known as conception, a series of changes begins that continues until death. These changes are categorized into stages of development that include the zygote, embryo, fetus, infant, toddler, child, adolescent, and adult. During the stages of pregnancy, the zygote and embryo can be referred to as the conceptus, which means that which was conceived. Before we actually get into the fertilization per se, I want to talk about some terminology that you're going to need to understand in order to move forward with me. We'll start with the Latin suffix nate. That's a suffix at the end of the word. Nate. It means born. So we use the terms prenatal to describe the events before birth and postnatal to describe the events after birth. The Greek prefix neo means new. So the newborn infant is also known as the neonate. Let's take a general look at the prenatal stages. The zygote stage begins as the diploid cell produced when a spermatozoon fertilizes a secondary oocyte. The diploid cell begins to multiply via mitosis into a series of stages that we'll discuss later on. When the conceptus transitions from zygote to embryo depends on who you're talking to. Some say it's as soon as there is more than one cell, while others consider the conceptus to be an embryo at about 16 days post-fertilization. This is when the cells of the conceptus form the primary germ layers, which are the embryonic stem cells that will give rise to all the body structures. The fetal period begins at the end of 8 weeks post-fertilization. That is when the beginnings of all organ systems are present. However, they're not quite functional yet, and a lot of growth and development is yet to come. The fetus starts at about 3 centimeters long, which is just over an inch. Assuming the pregnancy goes well, the fetus is typically ready to be born about 38 weeks post-fertilization, but there's some variation in there. Infancy begins with the neonate, or newborn, and lasts until 1 year after birth. The ranges for the remaining postnatal stages somewhat vary dependent on the source you're looking at, but roughly we can say that ages 1 through 3 are considered the toddler years, followed by childhood, which is 3 to 11, adolescence, 12 to 18, and then adulthood. Okay, let's get into fertilization now. When a haploid spermatozoan or sperm fertilizes a haploid secondary oocyte or egg cell, forming a diploid zygote, that's called fertilization. Recall from episode 71 that the release of an ovum or secondary oocyte is called ovulation. And once the ovulation occurs, that egg cell only has a lifespan of up to 24 hours. The problem is it takes several days for that egg cell to reach the uterus. So fertilization must take place in the uterine tube, typically between its ampulla and isthmus. Now, the vast majority of sperm do not make it past the cervical mucus or the vaginal acid. In fact, out of the 300 million sperm that are ejaculated, only about 200 reach the egg. 200 out of 300 million. That means that the chances are greater than 1 in a million of a sperm cell reaching the egg cell. Now, sperm cells are not ready to be effective fertilizers until about 10 hours after ejaculation. A process called capacitation, in which fluids from the female reproductive tract remove cholesterol from the sperm's plasma membrane, is necessary for fertilization to occur. This weakens the sperm's plasma membrane and makes it easier for its acrosome to release digestive enzymes. The sperm has a lifespan of up to 6 days in the female reproductive tract. So let's think about that. What is the range that fertilization is possible? So think about ovulation. Roughly day 14 after the onset of menstruation in the menstrual cycle. If there's an ovulation and we have an oocyte that's in the uterine tube, we've got 24 hours to fertilize it, which means we need to consider 2 lifespans: the 24-hour lifespan of the egg cell and the 6-day lifespan of the sperm cell inside the female reproductive tract. So you could have sexual intercourse 5 days before ovulation and still have a fertilization. However, more than 1 day after ovulation is no good because the egg cell only has 24 hours. If and when a sperm cell reaches an egg cell, the acrosome of the spermatozoan releases digestive enzymes that help penetrate the egg's granulosa cells and zona pellucida. Even though only 1 sperm can enter and fertilize an egg, 1 sperm's acrosomal enzymes may not be enough to clear the necessary path to the egg's plasma membrane. So it could take a support team of multiple spermatozoa and their collective enzymes to help that 1 sperm fertilize the egg. So let's talk about the granulosa cells of the corona radiata. They're bound together by hyaluronic acid. So one of the acrosomal enzymes is hyaluronidase, which breaks down hyaluronic acid so a sperm cell can make a path through the granulosa cells that surround the secondary oocyte. Once that path is made, a sperm binds to a protein in the zona pellucida called ZP3. The acrosome then releases another enzyme called acrosin. Acrosin breaks down the proteins of the zona pellucida so the sperm's plasma membrane can contact the egg's plasma membrane. So those enzymes that are in the acrosome of the sperm head are called acrosomal enzymes. Specifically, they are hyaluronidase and acrosin. The sperm head's plasma membrane then fuses to the egg's plasma membrane as the nucleus, midpiece, and a portion of the tail enter the egg. The egg destroys the sperm's mitochondria, which is in the midpiece. So only maternal mitochondria are passed on to offspring. Now, there is some research that is suggesting that some paternal mitochondrial DNA does make it into the zygote. Fertilization combines the 23 chromosomes of the haploid sperm with the 23 chromosomes of the haploid ovum, producing a diploid cell with 23 pairs of chromosomes. Fertilization by two or more sperm is called polyspermy and would produce a larger set of chromosomes, and the egg would die. We can't have 3 sets of chromosomes. There might be a situation where you have 3 of one chromosome, but we can't have 3 full sets. That typically would not survive. In fact, you probably would never even know that there was a fertilization. There are 2 ways that the body prevents polyspermy. The first is called the fast block to polyspermy, in which the binding of the sperm to the egg opens sodium ion channels in the egg's plasma membrane, depolarizing it. Remember, depolarizing means making the plasma membrane's resting membrane potential less negative. This inhibits the attachment of any more sperm to the plasma membrane of the egg cell. Then there's the slow block to polyspermy, which utilizes secretory vesicles called cortical granules. Let me explain that one. In response to sperm penetration, the egg cell releases its stores of calcium ions, which stimulates exocytosis of the cortical granules. Their enzyme destroys ZP3 in the zona pellucida, inhibiting the further binding of the sperm to the egg. The secretion also swells with water, which pushes the rest of the sperm away from the egg. So we're using these mechanisms to prevent multiple sperm cells from entering one egg cell. We add the slow block to polyspermy and the fast block to polyspermy. The fertilization of the secondary oocyte allows it to complete meiosis II. Remember from the previous episodes that egg cells don't finish meiosis unless they're fertilized. So only the very small minority of egg cells that actually get fertilized get to complete meiosis II. The nuclei of the gametes fuse to form a diploid cell called a zygote. Now, once the sperm head is inside the egg cell, the nuclei of the sperm and the egg cell are called pronuclei because they're about to fuse together and form one full diploid nucleus. So the pronuclei of the sperm and the egg cell fuse together in a process called syngamy, S-Y-N-G-A-M-Y. And this is the formation of a zygote, the fertilization of an egg cell by a sperm cell. Now, you might remember from previous episodes about the female reproductive system that when the female gametes are produced, the ova, the result of meiosis I is not 2 haploid cells. It is 1 haploid cell and a polar body which degenerates. That's called the first polar body. When a secondary oocyte is fertilized and completes meiosis II, the result is not two haploid gametes like we had with sperm cells, the result is the haploid gamete and a second polar body. And that haploid gamete is really a fertilized egg cell now. It's not really even a gamete anymore because fertilization's already taken place. That second polar body also is discarded, taking one chromatid from each chromosome with it so that we don't double up on our chromosomes. Like I said before, the nuclei of the sperm and egg cell form pronuclei. They swell up and become those pronuclei. Using microtubules produced by the sperm's centrosomes, the same organelles that produce microtubules for mitotic spindles in mitosis, the sperm pronucleus migrates toward the center of the egg where the egg's pronucleus is. The mitotic spindles allow them to be connected to one another, and they each break open, allowing the 23 unpaired chromosomes of the sperm to mingle with the 23 unpaired chromosomes of the egg. And the result is our 23 pairs of chromosomes with a diploid cell called a zygote. So this zygote is going to become an embryo and a fetus and be born, assuming everything goes well from this point on. And now we know that that new offspring has half of its chromosomes from the sperm and half of them from the egg. So the biological parents each get to contribute a set of chromosomes to this offspring. Now, in another episode later on, we're going to talk about genetics, and we'll talk about how it is determined which traits from each parent are going to be passed on and be expressed in our new individual. But for now, let's go back to our zygote. Now that we have our diploid zygote, it can begin dividing via mitosis. Meiosis is over. Now we have a diploid cell, so we're going to start doing mitosis. And we're going to produce more diploid cells on their way to becoming an embryo. Like I said before, everything that arises from the zygote can generally be referred to as the conceptus. Now, the first 16 days of development is called the pre-embryonic stage, which can be broken down into cleavage, implantation, and embryogenesis. During this time, the zygote divides into hundreds of cells. These cells organize themselves into the primary germ layers, and the conceptus attaches to the uterine wall. The mitotic divisions that occur in the first 3 days are called cleavage of the zygote. As the cleavage takes place, the conceptus migrates through the uterine tube toward the uterine cavity. Now, the conceptus doesn't have the power to move itself. It's not mobile. The epithelial lining of the uterine tube's lumen has motile cilia. Remember, these are the cilia that move, they produce waves, they beat. They have power strokes, and the power strokes of these cilia move the mucus in the lumen and the conceptus along with it. So the conceptus is basically riding waves of mucus through the uterine tube on its way to the uterus. The first cleavage takes place approximately 30 hours post-fertilization. The first 2 daughter cells of that first mitosis are called blastomeres. Each blastomere then divides into its own 2 daughter cells, which then divide into their own 2 daughter cells, and so on, doubling the number of blastomeres with each mitotic division. The time between divisions gets shorter and shorter as the cleavage goes on. So we start with 1, we get 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, and we go on and on and on from there. But we're still only at 16 cells or so, 72 hours post-fertilization. And at that point, 16 cells are called the morula. The morula is actually the same size as the zygote, because the blastomeres get smaller and smaller with each division, so there's enough room for the number of cells needed to produce the embryonic tissues. The reason for this is the zona pellucida of the original egg cell is still there. all this has to happen inside that ring around the egg cell called the zona pellucida. But don't worry, it's not going to be there forever. In fact, it's about to go. The morula doesn't immediately attach to the uterine wall. It gets to the uterine cavity and sits in there for about 4 or 5 days as its blastomeres continue dividing, resulting in about 100 cells. Then, the zona pellucida disintegrates, and the conceptus is released and takes the form of a fluid-filled sphere called a blastocyst. That blastocyst consists of 3 components. The outer layer is composed of squamous cells and called the trophoblast. There's an inner cell mass called the embryoblast, and the fluid-filled internal cavity is called the blastocoel. If the conceptus survives, the trophoblast will form part of the placenta, which will eventually provide nutrients to the embryo. The embryoblast will give rise to the embryo itself, and the blastocoel will become something called the yolk sac, which we'll talk about later. Now, in order for the blastocyst to become an embryo, fetus, and newborn, it must implant in the uterine wall. And obviously that process is called implantation. The development of the embryo is called embryogenesis. So let's talk about both of those processes. We'll begin with implantation, which begins when the blastocyst becomes attached to the endometrium, which happens about 6 days after ovulation. Remember, the endometrium is the inner lining of the uterus. It consists of 2 layers, the stratum functionalis and the stratum basale. The stratum functionalis is the layer that thickens and thickens and thickens throughout the menstrual cycle until eventually it degenerates and breaks down if there's no fertilization. Remember from episode 71 that if there is a fertilization, the hormone human chorionic gonadotropin targets the corpus luteum of the ovary and gets it to stay around so it continues to secrete estrogen and progesterone, keeping the uterine wall nice and thick and vascular and ready for implantation.
Bombas makes the most comfortable socks, underwear, and T-shirts.
Warning, Bombas are so absurdly comfortable you may throw out all your other clothes.
Sorry, do we legally have to say that?
No, this is just how I talk, and I really love my Bombas.
They do feel that good. And they do good, too. One item purchased equals one item donated.
To feel good and do good, go to bombas.com and use code AUDIO for 20% off your first purchase. That's bombas.com and use code AUDIO at checkout.
The trophoblast cells on the uterine side of the blastocyst divide into 2 layers. The syncytiotrophoblast, which grows deeper into the uterus, and the cytotrophoblast. Rather than multiple cells like the cytotrophoblast, the syncytiotrophoblast is a mass with multiple nuclei in its cytoplasm. It breaks down endometrial cells of the uterus as it forms its roots. In response, the endometrium begins to grow around the entire blastocyst. So the blastocyst doesn't just sit inside the uterine cavity attached to the wall, it actually becomes embedded in the uterine wall. Implantation takes about 7 or 8 days. The trophoblast is what is secreting the human chorionic gonadotropin, or HCG, that I talked about earlier. Remember, that's the hormone that over-the-counter pregnancy tests are looking for. In time, the trophoblast develops into the chorion, which assumes the role of the corpus luteum, making human chorionic gonadotropin unnecessary. Okay, now let's talk about embryogenesis, which begins during implantation. The main focus of embryogenesis is arranging the blastomeres into 3 primary germ layers that will eventually give rise to all of the tissues and organs. These layers are the ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm. First, the embryoblast and the trophoblast separate, creating a narrow space called the amniotic cavity. The embryoblast develops into a flat embryonic disc. The embryonic disc starts out as 2 layers. the epiblast and the hypoblast. So we call it bilaminar, which means 2 layers. As some of the hypoblast cells multiply, they form a membrane called the yolk sac. Now the embryonic disc is between 2 spaces, the amniotic cavity on the endometrial side and the yolk sac on the uterine cavity side. At roughly day 15 of development, the embryonic disc elongates and a thickened layer called the primitive streak forms along the midline of the epiblast. Down the middle of it is a primitive groove. Now the embryo is bilaterally symmetrical, and we can see what the right and left sides, dorsal and ventral surfaces, and cephalic and caudal ends will be. The development of the embryonic disc into 3 germ layers, a trilaminar embryonic disc, is called gastrulation. And again, those 3 layers are the ectoderm, endoderm, and mesoderm. It happens like this. The multiplying epiblast cells migrate medially toward and into the primitive groove. The hypoblast becomes the endoderm, which, among other things, will give rise to the lining of the digestive tract's lumen. Next, in a process called invagination, epiblast cells migrate through the primitive streak, landing in between the epiblast and the hypoblast. Invagination of these epiblast cells forms the mesoderm, a 3rd layer between the original 2. The remaining epiblast layer is called the ectoderm, which will give rise to the nervous system and the epidermis of your skin. That's the outer layer of the skin, the part you can touch. Eventually, the mesoderm differentiates into a loose fetal connective tissue called mesenchyme, which gives rise to muscle, cartilage, bone, and blood. Mesenchyme is composed of a loose network of long, thin, mesenchymal cells embedded in a gelatinous ground substance. Some mesodermal cells migrate outside the embryo and develop into the placenta. The formation of the 3 germ layers marks the completion of embryogenesis and the beginning of the embryonic period. It's about day 16 post-fertilization, and the new embryo is about 2 millimeters long. Now that the embryo is formed, it can become more of a 3-dimensional structure with organs. It's going to do that through what we call embryonic folding and organogenesis, the formation of new organs, the formation of the organs. However, we're going to cover that in the next episode. In the next episode, we'll get into embryonic folding and organogenesis, and then we'll talk about fetal development, and we'll get into what it takes to actually give birth to one of these things, and we'll talk about the aging process and senescence. Once again, I want to thank my guest, Sam Kean. What an amazing conversation that was. I really appreciate him coming on. You've got to check out his books and his podcast. His podcast is called The Disappearing Spoon. Check him out, samkean.com. You'll see everything you need about him. I'm posting links to his social media accounts, to his website, to his podcast in the show notes, so please check them out. Again, thank you for listening. I really appreciate it. I hope this is helping you get your B or better in A&P. Please take the time to rate and review the podcast on whatever platform you're using. I would really appreciate that. It really means a lot. And don't forget, if you have a question, email me, minus55media@gmail.com. Maybe I'll answer your question on the podcast. Thanks again for listening. Thanks again, Sam Kean. I'll talk to you next time. Anatomy and Physiology Bit by Bit is a production of Minus 55 Media and is hosted by the Believe Network. Please take the time to rate my show and leave a review. You can also check out the content I post on Instagram and YouTube as @StudentHelp4AP. That's the number 4, AP. Special thanks to my family, Bucks County Community College, and McGraw-Hill Education, where your instructor can find Anatomy and Physiology Digital Suite, my low-cost tutor video-based digital learning solution for anatomy and physiology currently being used at several colleges and universities. If your instructor isn't using Digital Suite, let them know about it. The link is in the show notes.